tensions. And as you will see, many of our examples from today are the histories of students and travelers and writers and artists who have crossed the Pacific over the past 150 years or so. So they bring to this longer history of engagement between China and America a sustained attempt at trying to arrive at a perhaps sometimes a better understanding of each other, more often than not, a more complex understanding of themselves and of also what kinds of cultural resources can be used to build a new nation for China and a better world sometimes, as imagined in these different contexts. We'll focus on 4 or 5 different specific contexts over this long history. One of which is the 1870s and 1880s. In China, this is still under the last imperial dynasty, the Qing dynasty. And this is when we had the first education missions and also the first Chinese migrant workers come to America. And there's a specific setting there for the beginning of this kind of cultural and educational engagement. We'll move on to the early 20th century when a larger cohort, as you can see from this image here, of Chinese students came over to America to study, and some of them had very interesting career paths and a legacy, I would say a cultural legacy on both sides of the Pacific. World War II is a period where China and the US found themselves to be allies, and a good number of international journalists and writers, including many Americans who became famous during the time, went to China to report on the war, but also to kind of make sense of the international situation. And we'll cover a few of their stories, including some artists who made interesting contributions to the internationalism of the period. We'll move a bit more quickly through the Cold War and then into the, in China, what's been called the Reform and Opening era since the 1980s. And have a couple of examples of Sino-American engagement from that period. We'll have an alumni appearance from one of your peers, one of your younger peers. And I'll end with a couple of examples from very recent examples of, or maybe even recommendations of younger and more contemporary engagement between China and the US on the part of journalists and writers. So to begin with, in one of your readings on the architectural students, Chinese architecture students in America, that piece actually revisited quite a bit the much longer history of, say, American interest in China as both an intellectual but and cultural curiosity, a market for tea and opium in the 19th century, a way to make fortunes for some European and American merchants. That's not really the history that we'll cover today, but that does serve as the background for a more sustained relationship. And the context that I would want to begin with today is the first equal treaty signed between China, or the Qing Empire back in the 19th century, and any Western nation, and this ended up being the United States, which was the Burlingame Treaty of 1868. And the first formal treaty, also a diplomatic treaty between the United States and China. As you can see from the quoted article within that treaty here, this was an equal treaty, unlike many of the treaties that would be signed before and after this between China and Western and also including Japan, imperialist countries, because many of those took the place after certain wars where China had lost and China had to pay reparations and give up certain concessions to trade, to sovereignty, and so on. The Burlingame Treaty, on the other hand, negotiated by Anson Burlingame, who was first sent to China by President Lincoln and then came back, appointed by the Qing government as China's first ambassador, leading China's first mission to the US, was more on equal levels, right? It recognized, as you can see here, the inherent and inalienable right of man to change his home and allegiance for the mutual advantages, free migration and immigration, of their citizens and subjects. So this is really about free movement and specifically movement of labor and trade, right? So looking to secure economic interests. A few years after the Burlingame Treaty, we see the very important contribution of Chinese railroad workers. 90% of the Pacific part of the Transcontinental Railroad were built by Chinese railroad workers. And also a first government-sponsored Chinese education mission to the United States. So both laborers and also would-be elites or intellectuals, if you will. The Chinese education mission was the brainchild of the first Chinese college student to graduate in America, a man by the name of Yunwen, pictured on your left here. He had been brought over in the mid-19th century by American missionaries and studied at Yale, studied engineering at Yale, returned to China, even though he was naturalized as a US citizen, to become an advisor for some Chinese government officials in the mid-19th century in the context of mid-century rebellions and wars in China, but really wanted to have more Chinese young men come to the US to be educated like he did. And so this was the CEM, Chinese Education Mission, that began in 1872, that over the course of the next 10 years sponsored, as you can see, 120 young men, some of them quite young, not almost just barely teenagers, coming over from the provinces of Guangdong and Fujian, and being hosted in New England, predominantly host families, moving on to maybe some of the private academies and then the universities in this region. Quite a number of them, like you can see from the bottom picture here, got involved in social activities, specifically cultural activities like baseball and rowing, and eventually many of them studied subjects like engineering and science, and a few of them went on to have illustrious careers back in China. For example, the engineer Zhan Tianyou, who is often noted as the father of Chinese railroads. So this was a promising beginning for the history of Chinese and American co-education and cooperation. But of course, as you can probably tell from the date that this ended, part of the reason that the Chinese education ended relatively quickly was because of a wave of anti-Chinese sentiment that resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. In addition, I should say, to also conservative and also factionalism dynamics on the Chinese side in this case. The Chinese Exclusion Act did not exclude actually students or intellectuals or even merchants, but laborers, right? Specifically in response to white labor agitation and anti-Chinese discrimination during this time. And over the next several decades, we would see definitely a slowdown of Chinese laborers and migrants entering, but eventually a new group of Chinese students to come over to America. The impetus for this is something that many of you are perhaps familiar with or have heard of, which is the Boxer crisis or uprising of 1900, in which a nativist movement of so-called Boxers from North China moved into the key cities of Tianjin and Beijing in the north to attack both foreigners, specifically Christian missionaries, but also Chinese converts to Christianity. And the Qing government ultimately decided to support this movement, which resulted in open declaration of war that then resulted in an 8-nation allied expedition, which included the United States, but also countries like Germany, Britain, France, Russia, the Japanese for the first time in China. As you can see from this image here, this wasn't just a punitive mission against the Boxers, but a expedition to stamp out superstition, supposedly backwardness in China, and to sweep in civilization, right? From this image from the Brooklyn Eagle. The Boxer War ended very quickly, and poorly for the Qing court, which had to pay a huge set of reparations to all parties involved. This was the Boxer Protocols. But in the open door policy and context of the early 1900s, in which the U.S. tried to act as the perhaps most goodwill of the Western powers in China, the United States decided to return the Boxer indemnity reparations, about 17 million, in the form of scholarships for Chinese students to come over to America. And in order to prepare them for this Transpacific journey and eventual transnational education, a set of preparatory schools, including Tsinghua Preparatory School, the forerunner of the now renowned Tsinghua University, was set up to prepare Chinese students to come to the United States to study. So over the next couple of decades, many Boxer Indemnity students came over to the United States to study abroad. And this is perhaps the early 20th century, the moment that we have the formation of this identity of what we would call in Chinese 留学生, or study abroad, or returned students. And about 1,300 students studied at predominantly northeastern United States institutions. Again, some of them might have come over for the last years of prep school. Others entered directly into the universities. We should mention that, again, it wasn't just all study. This was also about a certain kind of social acculturation and exchange. So just like how Asian and international students may be involved in extracurricular activities on U.S. college campuses today, Chinese students back then were involved in the recreational and everyday life and sports activities in the U.S. universities then. Notably, with the Boxer Indemnity cohorts, women were included as well. For instance, the eventual educator and writer and historian Chen Hengzhe studied at Wellesley College in the 1910s. She studied at Vassar, but I have pictured here a Wellesley Chinese Students Club. And she eventually received a master's degree from the University of Chicago and became the first female professor at Beijing University in 1920, when Beijing University became co-educational for the first time. She was also a part of a new wave of returned students from the United States and other parts of the world who became involved in the 1910s in something called the New Culture, or May 4th movement, which encompassed both a cultural movement to rebel against or call for reforms against what the new generations of both teachers and students perceived to be backwards, traditional Confucian culture, patriarchal culture specifically, but also a wave of political activism against what was seen as ineffectual negotiations by the now Republican and warlord government in the 1910s in the World War I stage, and specifically the denial of the return of Chinese territory from the Japanese at the Paris Peace Conference, and cemented in stone by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, after which about 3,000 students in Beijing went into the streets to demonstrate, and this is May 4th of 1919, hence the name. But for our purposes, some of these transnational, transpacific personalities were involved in a longer period of what we would call the New Culture movement, which was, again, not necessarily just political, but also a movement to reform and recreate new language, new literature, new gender relations, and a new role for intellectuals and students in a new cosmopolitan and international perspective as well. Perhaps the most emblematic of these intellectuals is the former Cornell and Columbia student Hu Shi, who is pictured here in his dorm room at Cornell University, also with a page from his notebook in around 1914, where he participated not only in the Chinese Student Association in America, but also something called the Cosmopolitan Club, a club of students from all nationalities, whose motto was, as you can see here, above all nations is humanity. Hu Shi became a renowned and important philosopher, literary historian, a liberal activist, and a diplomat in the United States. He changed his specialization from agriculture to philosophy and moved from Cornell to eventually work with the American philosopher John Dewey at Columbia and receive his Ph.D. Even while he was in America, he was interested in suggestions for cultural reform in China. And among the essays that he wrote, the most famous one of which was something called A Proposal for the Reform of Literature, which he sent to a new magazine called New Youth in China, perhaps a flagship magazine of this new culture movement, published in 1917, in which he promoted, among others of his time, the use of vernacular prose, or 白话文 in Chinese, and also the idea of using vernacular writing in poetry. This is against the centuries, perhaps millennia-long tradition of what was perceived to be a more rigid version of writing in classical Chinese. Vernacular prose would be to write as you speak, and this was meant to bring in a much broader range of literary works from history, but also to enable more public participation in the formation of a new literary and national culture. Hu Shi was also known to be a promoter of the philosophy of pragmatism, inherited from his teacher John Dewey. And so he took a more liberal stance to some of these social and cultural upheaval and political upheaval in China in the 1920s. He would eventually also serve as wartime ambassador to the United States in the late 30s and 40s. Hu and many of his peers of this first generation of Boston STEM students were also very much interested in science. Part of the May 4th era slogan was to bring Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy back to China. And one of the things that they did was to form a series of organizations. And so again, volunteer association and which involved elections, right, of members and chairs and meetings across regions and eventually across nations, was a big part of this socialization of the Chinese students in America in the 1910s and 20s. And one prominent organization was the Science Society of China, formed at Cornell, again in 1914, including not only students who were interested in science and engineering and agriculture and biology, but also others who were more attached to the humanities or studied psychology, that were interested in bringing a scientific outlook to intellectual discourse, and also to have a role for themselves in intellectual and cultural reform in China. The Science Society would eventually expand and return to China. Here they are pictured. Again, you see the presence of women in here in 1924 in Nanjing. And for the next couple of decades, were very active as a part of a number of intellectual and professional groups that perhaps enlarged a emerging civil society in a rather politically still chaotic Republican period. Another part of the New Culture movement was the bringing of Chinese or of international speakers to China, and we'll run through this very quickly. But some of the elites in the New Culture movement set up a speaking society to bring, for instance, the U.S. philosopher John Dewey on a lecture tour to China in the 1920s. He's pictured here with another one of his famous students, the educator Tao Xingzhi, who brought some of Dewey's educational philosophies melded with his own Confucian interpretations into a set of rural reforms in the 1930s. American activist Margaret Sanger was invited to both Japan and China in the 1920s in the context of movements for gender equality to introduce Chinese young men and women to the idea of birth control. And here she is pictured with Hu Shi and other intellectuals at Peking University. Again, literature was very much a big part of this. So the Nobel Prize winner, the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, was invited to China in 1924 on a speaking tour where he became a spokesperson writing in English during this period for world peace and also an idea of Pan-Asianism between China and India. He is pictured here, and I introduced this slide here because this is something I always use for my modern China class to introduce a specifically Worcester connection with some of the young men and women who became his friends and interpreters on this tour. Pictured on the very far right are two young poets, Xu Zhimo and Lin Huiyin, who I'll talk about very shortly, who play an important role in this cultural story. Xu Zhimo, who is perhaps very widely known and recognized as the leading new poet of the 20th century, was a student at Clark University in Worcester, and a student actually in economics at both Clark and then Columbia University, before he decided that he also wanted to pursue philosophy and humanities instead, and then went to Cambridge in the 1920s. He eventually joined Hu Shi in forming a literary society called the Crescent Moon Society, in which they promoted some of these new themes of vernacular writing, and for Xu specifically a trend in introducing romantic poetry, focusing on ideas and motifs of nature, imagination, individual freedom for China. And because of his Cambridge association, he has a very famous poem called Second Farewell to Cambridge. He is prominently a part of contemporary tourism, Chinese tourism in Cambridge, as you can see here. But he does have a Worcester connection. The other part of his story that made him very famous is that he was a romantic not only in his literary practice, but also in real life. While he was in Cambridge, Xu famously fell in love, even though he was married at the time, with a young woman named Lin Huiyin, pictured on your left here. She was the daughter of China's representative to the League of Nations in the aftermath of World War I. And she was quite young at the time and already introduced not to Xu, but to the son of perhaps the most famous reformer and intellectual in early 20th century, Liang Qichao, whose son Liang Sicheng eventually became her husband. And so even though Xu and Lin eventually did not have a relationship, they became very good friends, and their this triangulated love story is something that's a popular lore in China since their discovery story was discovered. But Lin Huiyin and Liang Sicheng are a very important part of our story, and they're part of one of the readings I give you to look at because they are part of a cohort of about 50 or so Chinese students of that Box Indemnity cohort who came to the United States to study architecture. And many of them enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania, which was a hotbed of what we called Beaux-Arts architectural education in the 1920s. Liang and Lin took what they learned from their professors at UPenn and their interest in discovering a architectural history and writing an architectural history for a new emerging new China, and they went back and investigated in many of the northern and northern-western provinces medieval era architecture, and Liang Sicheng became a renowned architectural historian, and Lin as well, both involved in contemporary urban planning as well as coming up with a very sophisticated, internationally informed architectural history for modern China. Some of their peers were involved in more of the modernist aspects of building the new republic in China. For instance, Deng Dayou is very famous as another UPenn graduate for his involvement in the Greater Shanghai Plan of the late 1920s, in which he was responsible for many of the civic architecture that we associate with modern Shanghai. And I also give you an example of his own residence pictured here, which you can see is a very modernist kind of style, remnants perhaps also of other international architects transplanted to America, such as Walter Gropius, whose house you can see in Lincoln, not too far away from us. Liang and Lin and Dong's generation were soon caught up in the next set of wars and upheavals in China, which was the global World War II for China. But before then, they also made some friends from the United States. And Lin Huiyin and Liang Sicheng most famously became very good friends with an American couple by the name of John King Fairbank and Wilma Fairbank. John Fairbank was a Ph.D. student in Chinese history, modern Chinese history, who went to do field work for his dissertation in China in the 1930s, where he met with Liang and they became very good friends. Wilma Fairbank became an art historian of China. And Fairbank returned to the United States to set up Harvard as perhaps the center of Chinese studies for the next few decades, but also many of his students then spanned out across the United States and founded many centers. And a lot of us who are trained in the United States as historians of China can trace our intellectual lineage back to Fairbank. But because of the global World War II and eventually the Cold War, these two couples would not see each other, only maintain contact by writing, but even that was cut off after the 1940s. China and the US became allies during World War II, and there were many interesting personalities, both political and cultural, who went back and forth during this time to share stories and also to make the Chinese and US public more aware of the importance of cooperation in this war. Most famously in the US as a political personality was the wealthily educated First Lady of China, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, or Song Mei-ling, who visited the US on a speaking tour and gave several speeches in Congress in 1943. Here she is pictured with Eleanor Roosevelt. And here are the Chiangs pictured with the US military advisor in China during the war, General Joseph Stilwell. But perhaps more publicly or culturally influential during this time were a group of writers who wrote in English about China from a various perspectives. So many of you may have heard of Pearl Buck, whose novels and journalistic pieces about China, whose eventually adventures in publishing introduced a US audience in the 1930s and 40s to China. She was also played a role in bringing the bilingual and bicultural Chinese writer Lin Yutang to New York, where he stayed for the next 30 years and wrote many best-selling books in English in the US at the time, including some of his own liberal, humorous philosophy and treatment of Chinese culture, but also some novels that try to give an image of Chinese society during the war. There was the American journalist Edgar Snow, famous for his coverage of the Communist Party movement during, and specifically his portrayal of Mao Zedong during the war, as well as the radical journalist Edgar Smedley, who was also a major personality in China and wrote of the communist side of the war, both against Japan and eventually against the nationalists. The Boston based journalist Theodore White went to China as a reporter for Time and Life magazine in the 1940s and reported on both the war and most famously a big famine that broke out in 1942 in China, and wrote a famous book called Thunder Out of China in 1946, in which he was actually also very critical of the nationalists. I have to skip over, for the interest of time, a couple of slides, but one of the examples that I gave you of very interesting Trans-Pacific relations during this time was of the coming of being of what is now known as the Chinese national anthem, And that is the March of Volunteers, which was first a national salvation song, a song during China's War of Resistance against the Japanese invasion and occupation that became a transnational uh, uh, song of activism at the hands of the Dutch but Hollywood-based filmmaker Joris Ivens, who used it in his film, The 400 Million, and then the African-American activist and singer Paul Robeson, who performed a Chinese version of the song in the 1940s. Robeson famously was multi-talented, athlete, actor, activist, and also learned Chinese at the School of Oriental African Studies in London for a while. He was very interested in Chinese culture and recorded the March of Volunteers, a bilingual version of this in 1941. As you can see from the lyrics here, what Robeson might have also introduced was an idea of international and transnational democracy and civil rights, right, in these lyrics. This was such a famous song that it also made an appearance in one of the key American novels of the 20th century, Philip Roth's Portnoy Complaint, in which the Roth-like protagonist has heard of the song in his youth in grade school. At the end of World War II, Chinese activists and, for instance, the Columbia-trained educator and philosopher P.C. Chang were involved in the making of the post-war world. P.C. Chang played a significant role in the writing and drafting of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And Liang Sicheng spent some time in New York to plan the United Nations headquarters. But because of the cutting off of relations between the U.S. and America, between America and China after 1949, Lin and Liang were cut off from their U.S. ties because they decided to stay on mainland China. Lin's brother came over to America to study at the University of Washington in 1948, and he eventually had a daughter named Meyer, who grew up to be a renowned Chinese-American architect herself, who did not find out about her aunt's history until very late into the early 21st century. Of course, Meyer Lin is the architect and designer of our Vietnam Veterans Memorial, whereas Liang Sicheng and Lin Huiyin were eventually recruited to be involved in urban planning and also the designing of the monument to the people's heroes in the center of Tiananmen Square. So separated family histories, but very interesting convergence of trajectories in this example here. Another example of a Chinese-American intellectual and scientist that I gave you a short article on, who was cut off from her homeland during the Cold War, was, of course, the nuclear physicist Wu Jianxiong, who became known as the Marie Curie of China, but made significant contributions to both the Manhattan Project and also to post-war physics and radiation research, for she was probably not improperly recognized, partly because of her gender. After towards the later parts of the Cold War, many of you know that there was the detente between China and the U.S. A reconciliation that began with Richard Nixon's visit to China in 1972, and after China opened up again in the 1980s, there was another series of intellectual exchanges as well. For instance, the writers Paul Engel and his Chinese wife, Hualing Nie Engel, hosted an international writing program at the very famous Iowa Writers, one of the most famous creative writing workshops in America. And they hosted year after year in the 1980s, throughout the 2000s, a series of renowned Chinese writers to come over to America. And it's through efforts like these and efforts by American translators and academics that we now have a widely available assortment of contemporary Chinese literature that's available for the American public and also college students at Holy Cross to study and read. We also have some Chinese artists who came over in the 1980s to New York. And some of these names are very famous on the contemporary world art scene these days, Ai Weiwei and Xu Bing. Among them, the musician Tan Dun studied at Columbia in the 1980s and was the composer for films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, was involved in the 2008 Olympics, and was recently appointed as the director of the Bard Conservatory of Music. Here he is pictured in his apartment in the 1980s in New York. Americans also went to China in the 1980s when China opened up, and this was a pattern that would continue well into the 1990s and 2000s. And one specific set of examples are cohorts of Peace Corps volunteers that I introduced to you via one of our readings. Most famously, the writer Peter Hessler, who began as a volunteer in a remote town in Sichuan, but then wrote of experiences and then became a reporter for the New Yorker and wrote many, many well-received books, sensitive books about perhaps less about politics, more about ordinary Chinese life. That was a fascination not only to American readers, but eventually also Chinese readers. Another Peace Corps writer is Michael Meyer, who made a similar trajectory, went to China in 1996 and wrote a couple of very good books about the urbanization of Beijing and also the transformation of northeastern China. Both Meyer and Hessler, among other American writers of nonfiction and travel writing, have been translated into Chinese and have been caught up in this new wave in the past 10 years or so of fascination with nonfiction writing in China, which is consumed via books, via cell phones and apps and on the internet. And you can see there are books very popular among a urban elite reading audience in China today. And so they're part of a discourse then not only of writing of China, but also of non-fictional writing as well. Of course, Peter Hessler also introduced you in the article I asked you to look at today to the end of the Peace Corps class or operations in China in 2020 as a result, perhaps, of some of these tensions that have built up. And to end today, I wanted to introduce you to one of your fellow alums, Jerome Xianko, who was in that very last cohort of Peace Corps volunteers. And I interviewed Jerome for a few minutes to get his side of the story. And I wanted to share that with you briefly here. Xianko, a Holy Cross alum, who's going to tell us a little bit about his experience as a Peace Corps volunteer in China. Jerome, can you first tell us what year you were at Holy Cross and your major?
Thank you, Professor, for having me. I graduated the College of the Holy Cross in 2019, majoring in Asian Studies with a concentration in Peace and Conflict Studies.
Great, thank you. And Jerome, you were in China with the Peace Corps just a little over a year ago, I guess. Could you tell us, maybe to start with, why you chose the Peace Corps after graduation and why specifically China?
I knew during my time at Holy Cross, service to the community was important to me, and it was shown through the activities and the events I was involved in as a Holy Cross student. So come senior year at Holy Cross, I was looking at different service opportunities after graduation before going into a more career-oriented position. So thinking about if I wanted to go domestic or international, I had done all 4 years in Worcester, so I had not had the chance to fully study and live abroad. So I was looking at more international service opportunities that also related to my major of Asian Studies. So hence looking at the Peace Corps as a viable option that also had good opportunities after Peace Corps service. And looking at options in the Asia region, China, the program in China seemed like a great option to work with students and work with communities And also I had taken Chinese as my language at Holy Cross. So to be able to develop those language and cross-cultural communication skills further that I had begun at Holy Cross.
Great. And I know Peace Corps volunteers are sent to pretty specific places in China, not necessarily the major cities. Could you tell us where you went, and then how long you were there for, what your experience there was?
Mhm. So the Peace Corps volunteers in China have postings are sent to communities in Southwest China, which when thinking about China, most people think of maybe Beijing or Shanghai, but the communities that we were going to are on the other side of the country and a little different from the larger metropolitan areas where there's a saying in Chinese where the mountains are high, and when you go as more west from Beijing, the landscape does change. And so the communities that we were teaching in, and myself specifically, it was a little bit more rural, traditionally historically farmland communities that are still have a lot of growth. And in China, what we all did, we were all education volunteers. So I taught English at a university, Liu Panshui Normal University. Teaching was my primary role, but then also sharing Western cultures and ideas, as well as sharing my Peace Corps experience back home domestically with friends and community members here in the United States.
So you really became a cultural mediator in that sense.
Yes. One of the sayings in Peace Corps is that you're always a volunteer. You're always wearing this hat 24/7, and really being a representation of the U.S. In your community. For a lot of my first year students who were just starting out in university, I was really their first interaction, first person that they ever met from the United States. And so it was great being able to be that introduction to the U.S. for them.
What was life like outside the classroom locally?
That is what partially surprised me. That life outside of the classroom was pretty similar in regards to daily routines to my life here in the U.S., where I developed routines and habits of going to the gym, eating out with friends. I made a lot of host country national, host community friends that really helped keep me grounded and maintain a perspective of the work that I was doing, where I was able to develop a good sense of community. And also to think about when I went to China was right after graduating from Holy Cross. I think we can all agree, as everyone who's been a part of the Holy Cross community, that Holy Cross is something special and you develop bonds with the people there. So I was able to take what I learned at Holy Cross and those skills and then try to develop the similar bonds in my new community overseas.
And unfortunately, though, that those bonds were um, cut off a little bit due to unforeseen events of last year. And in January of 2020, the Peace Corps program in China was cut off, right? And you were caught in that moment, and that was actually the moment that the COVID outbreak actually already began in China, but was eventually going to spread in the world. What was it like to be there in person? This is really amazing that we have a Holy Cross alum right there for this.
I think back to January and the first week of February in 2020, and it was completely wild and a mix of emotions and everything that was happening. So the academic year ended for everyone like the first week, 2 weeks of January. And then we actually all gathered in the same city that the Peace Corps office was headquartered in China for a 2 week conference. So a lot of highs, great seeing other volunteers that we haven't seen for a couple months and just reconnecting and also preparing for that next semester. But however, yes, Professor, as you said, it was the last day of our training that we learned, unfortunately, that the Peace Corps program in China was going to end. And with the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, that only sped the closure up a little bit with all of us volunteers being evacuated out of China come that last week of January. So a lot of emotions, I think when you're when you're going from being excited for another year and a half to being told that you're going to be the legacy cohort that Peace Corps China has been in operation since '93. So thinking about that legacy and being the, for me, my program site in my city began in 2001. So thinking about representing 19 years of a history for me at my site, but then also 27 years of a program. What does it mean to be that representation? And I think that was a heavy burden, something I thought about often when I was back here in the U.S.
This gives us something to think about, I think. Okay, and Jerome is currently, after returning to the U.S., currently pursuing a master's degree in international studies in Monterey. And he tells me that he's going to be soon involved in also a series of conferences online, of course, with in Beijing University on recoupling between East and West. So we wish him the best of luck, but I thought he would be a really good example for us to end on in terms of bringing home the story to Holy Cross of this rich and diverse array of China and US cultural relations and exchanges over the past century and half. I realize I've gone a little bit over time, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. I believe we also may be able to go over a few minutes after 10 if necessary, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Professor Renner. We do have some questions from the participants. First question is, do you see any possibility of the Biden administration reopening Peace Corps and the Fulbright programs in China? And then a follow-up question, how much resistance do you think the present Chinese government would have?
Thank you for those questions. Again, I have to say with all of these questions, these are very important questions. These are questions that I think of, especially when I think of former students like Jerome and the opportunities that they may or may not have. But as a historian, I must also say that we are not, we can't really prognosticate for the future. And my sense is that the Fulbright program is probably on its way back, Fulbright program in China, which really funds, right, a lot of American research in China in the social sciences, in the humanities. Many of my peers in Chinese history, American historians of China have benefited from Fulbright programs. The Peace Corps may be taking a little bit more time. We'll have to see. It seems like there's a under the Biden administration, perhaps a more friendly context for that. But there's also this whole bigger question of course, geopolitics, more recent tensions, and behavior that we cannot really predict on either side of the Pacific. And so we will really have to wait and see, I think.
Thank you. Another question we have is, students in China study English and American culture at a relatively early age. Do you see this trend coming to the US? In other words, are students studying Chinese language and culture at an earlier age?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And for some of the alums here who it's been a while since you've graduated, if you came back physically today to Holy Cross, you might be interested to know that we have a very vibrant Chinese language program at the college here with language and literature classes in traditional and modern Chinese literature. We've had Chinese film classes. We have linguistics specialists and also tutors from Taiwan. And many of our students go on to pursue further study. We've had students, not just Jerome, but others who've gone to study abroad in China, in Taiwan, to prestigious programs like the Schwarzman Exchange Program at Tsinghua University. And of course, we're just a very microcosm of the larger picture of American interest and studies. And I get from a lot of my students that some of them have studied a year or two of Chinese in high school. And so that's also something that has been phenomenon, right, in recent decades, I think. So it's trending upwards, of course, due to all of this interest in international affairs. And it's my hope that those political concerns don't interfere too much, right, with the cultural education.
Do you think the cultural differences are a greater source of conflict and misunderstanding than the competing economic and political systems between the two countries, our two countries?
Well, I think as I've tried to demonstrate, it really is hard to say that at any one time there is a monolithic Chinese or American culture. It really depends on who is interpreting the culture for your fellow countrymen or for the other side. And there's been a lot of people, both Chinese Americans, who are very interested and have become experts in various facets, right, of culture, intellectual trends, ideas, literature, architecture, as I've shown, and I see that as examples of bridges to understanding, to cooperation, even within professions or specialized fields, rather than obstacles. And it's probably politics or ideologies or hard geopolitical interests, right? That may be more of the obstacle here.
What topics, what nonfiction topics are Chinese people particularly interested in today?
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is again something that's been fairly recent as a kind of interest in reading nonfiction worldwide. If you walk into any Chinese bookstore today, you'll see a wide selection of translated literature, both fiction and nonfiction. And so travel writing is very popular. And anybody from Bruce Chatwin to Jan Morris to, as I mentioned, Peter Hessler, their writings are available in Chinese. And of course, that's also spawned kind of a renewed interest in doing the same kind of reporting that Hessler has done. For example, Hessler in some of his books writes about these marginal families in rural townships in China during the years when China was really becoming a great economy. And some of the stories that might have been lost if we're just looking at GDPs or international relations and so on. And some young Chinese journalists and reporters have really caught that strain, right, of going and doing this kind of on the ground reporting. So reporting of migrant workers, for instance, in China, first person stories, again, of social and urban change. And a lot of that's really, really good and interesting stuff. So very, very varied kind of media sphere that's emerged from at least this one type of new interest.
So we'll have time for two more questions. One from participant just sent in. Considering the difficulties with the present trade negotiations and between the United States and China and the events going on in Hong Kong today, could you comment on what you think the near future of the China-US relationship is?
Yeah, that's probably something that's on everybody's minds these days. Again, I have to say, as a historian, anything I say about the future is probably nonsense. But it doesn't look too promising in terms of, again, political or diplomatic relations these days, right? If you've followed some of the negotiations or some of the news in recent weeks, that is something that's readily present. On the other hand, what I've tried to show in this discussion today is that we've had Cold Wars, we've had a Chinese exclusion, we've had the Boxer Wars, and none of those things had stopped, right? The international exchange of students and travelers and people who are interested in learning more about other cultures, but also reforming and changing themselves and fashioning cosmopolitan personalities. And that is something that I see continuing despite of the hard political realities these days. One example that I wanted to show at the end of the talk today, and I can briefly share my screen with you again, is the rise of, for instance, especially during COVID, if people can't travel anywhere, there's been a new wave of Chinese international students, former Chinese international students, who are now Chinese or Chinese American journalists. And they have done remarkable stuff in writing and also in podcasts. So a group of young women formed a podcast 2 years ago that I would recommend to anyone who listens in Chinese, but they're based in New York and in California, and it's called Loud Murmurs, and they dissect contemporary issues, cultural issues, social issues through the lens of conversations over and with guests, sometimes over American films. As you can see here, they talked about Oprah's interview with Meghan and Harry. They talked about the phenomenon of the film Minari, and they've also interviewed African-American students in China and experiences there. And this is for a Chinese-speaking audience, both here and also in China or globally as well. And so I see new media outlets like this as really potential, right, to kind of overcome some of our current geopolitical difficulties.
And one last question. If we wanted to read more about the topics you discussed today, could you recommend a few books we might read?
Yeah, I would really recommend books by these two Peace Corps writers that I introduced. So Michael Meyer, again here, and Peter Hessler. Partly because, and I would especially recommend perhaps Hessler's Rivertown, which is about his own journey as a young American in China in the 1990s. And Michael Meyer's written a fabulous book about his own trajectory there as well. And they give you, and these are very interestingly two Midwestern, Meyer's from Minnesota, Hessler's from Colorado. So they bring kind of a Midwestern American perspective to their interactions with the urban and rural population in China. And together their books span about 15 to 20 years of China's immense changes. If you're, and they're fabulous writers as well. So, if you're starting for the first time, these are great books to begin with.
Well, Professor Ren, thank you very much for your participation. We're grateful for having you. And again, we're very happy with this presentation. For everyone that's listening, keep in mind there'll be two more presentations this morning at 10:15. Professor Nadine Knight from the English department will present on Toni Morrison's Dangerous Women. And then at 11:30, Professor Andre Isaacs, who's actually an alum from the class of 2005, will present on the chemistry of wine. So in the meantime, I hope you'll get yourself a virtual jelly donut, and we'll see you back at 10:15. Again, Professor Ren, thank you very, very much. It was a fascinating presentation.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, everyone.